Have you ever wondered how two runologists can read the same inscription and reach completely different translations? Sometimes the difference is in the interpretation of the writing system. Hello, Rune Scholar. I'm the modern Erilar, and today we'll use the Roes Stone from Gotland to see how just a handful of rune forms that changed between the Elder Futhark and the Younger can produce entirely different readings of the same text. The Roes Stone was recovered under the roots of a hazel bush in Gotland parish toward the south end of the island of Gotland. It features the figure of a horse, possibly also a bird or the beginnings of a human figure, and a short inscription written vertically from top to bottom. The stone itself is relatively small as runestones go, only 77 centimeters across at its widest point. Unlike many runic inscriptions, the Roes stone does not resist interpretation because its text is badly damaged. Instead, it sits at a moment when the writing system itself was changing. To understand why runologists disagree over words, we first need to understand what was happening to the runic alphabet during the 8th century when the stone may have been carved. The language being written changed between Elder and Younger Futhark. As Proto-Scandinavian developed into the languages broadly grouped together as Old Norse, several vowels shifted and new vowel sounds emerged through processes like I-umlaut. The Younger Futhark therefore had to represent more vowel sounds with fewer vowel runes. And the result is that the same rune could sometimes be interpreted in more than one way. The Roes stone is one example of that broader problem. During periods of script reform, like that between the 6th and the 8th centuries, old and new conventions often coexist, making certain readings much harder to achieve. How do runologists recognize transitional inscriptions? Michael Barnes argued that two features are especially diagnostic. He identified the presence of a star rune with a sound value either A or H to be the most important indicator, and the second most important being how G and D sounds are indicated through gradual replacement of the Elder Futhark Gebo and Dagos with Younger Futhark Kaun and Tyr. If you look just after the first division mark in this particular inscription, and then look at the second to last rune, you'll see that the Roes stone contains both. And that tells us that we're dealing with a transitional inscription. The direction of the stave on the 5th rune might read as an A sound value if this were a Younger Futhark inscription. The direction of the branch for a now these rune in Elder Futhark, however, was not fixed, and many scholars have interpreted this rune as now these, since the possessive reading eu thin, this horse, makes sense given the picture of the horse with which it appears. This illustrates a useful rule in runology: date the writing system before translating the inscription. Identifying individual runes is difficult enough. However, here the carver combines several runes into an unusual compound graph. A Dagos rune forms the central part of this bind rune, where both staves of the central rune are extended, and the right stave is where we read additional runes. The rune on the bottom has most often been read as an uruz or an ur rune, and the top rune could be either an Elder Futhark Z or an ending R, an Ir rune, or in Younger Futhark, an M sound value. Usually the presence of a rune on the right would tell us that these runes should be read after the rune on the left. And interpretations that followed Leopold Loeffler's 1902 interpretation did read this bind rune as dyr, which means animal. The reading that has gained the most acceptance among modern runologists is that this bind rune is read from bottom to top and represents the personal name Udr or Alder. Nearly all runologists identify the central rune as Dagos. One minority interpretation proposes Hagalaws because of one interpretation of this inscription from Uppland in Sweden, but most specialists reject that reading because the phonological evidence does not support it. The seventh rune is either an R or a B sound value, more likely an R. Rune 8 is the star rune and more likely to be a vowel in this position, so probably an A value, more common to Danish inscriptions instead of the H that it could represent in other parts of Scandinavia. So here and in the interpretation of the Dagos rune, we have to also consider geographical context when determining a likely sound value for a given rune graph. Most of the inscription can therefore be read with reasonable confidence. The greatest uncertainty comes at the very end. Everything that we've examined so far leads to one final problem, and it is the one that ultimately determines how the inscription ends. A key difficulty in interpreting the Roes inscription lies in the final rune, and to understand the interpretation of the final rune, we have to stop thinking about the language and return to the evidence on the stone itself. Sofia Peresvet of Morath's 2011 analysis of the carving observed that the final stroke is unusually short relative to the other branches. It is positioned high on the main stave and does not fully meet it, making its classification ambiguous. This ambiguity has produced a range of readings. Early 20th century interpretations sometimes combined this graph with the preceding runes and identified both as a repeating Dagals. Other proposals include readings as an F or a K sound value. While none of these interpretations is definitive, the reading K yielding rak has become the most widely accepted. Magnus Olsson interpreted the word rak to be a preterite of Old Swedish vräcka that showed Old Gutnish W loss before R, suggesting that the word intended should be vräk. The various interpretations of this past tense verb are wrought, drove, persecuted, chased, avenged, or punished. Here we can see why runologists spend so much time examining individual rune forms. A single uncertain branch can change not only one word, but the interpretation of an entire inscription, producing very different translations. The disagreement also illustrates a broader issue characteristic of transitional period inscriptions. Small graphical variations can produce fundamentally different readings, because rune shape and phoneme value were both in flux at the time. After working through the linguistic ambiguity, the most conservative interpretation remains that Uther drew this horse. That conclusion may seem less dramatic than the curse interpretations we examined in our last episode, but it illustrates an important principle of runology. Our interpretations must remain proportional to the evidence. The challenge is often not just in deciphering damaged inscriptions, but in determining what a rune meant at the time that it was carved. The Roes Stone reminds us that runology is rarely about translating a fixed text. It's about reconstructing a writing system in transition where every inscription becomes another piece of evidence for how language and writing evolved. Sometimes our most valuable conclusion is not certainty, but understanding why uncertainty remains out of reach. Next time, we'll leave semantic interpretation behind and turn to chronology. Can the length of rune branches tell us when an inscription was carved? On an amulet from Möllebjerg, the answer may be yes. We'll examine how the forms of runes can become evidence for dating an inscription. Until then, thank you for reading the runes with me, the Modern Erilar.